Welcome back to the second episode of Two Latvians and a Spaniard, which is what we're going to call this podcast now. So Edo, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so continuing with our theme of discussing Latvia's economy in this increasingly shifting geopolitical
It's turbulent
environment.
time.
It really is. I wanted to add that it's now the weather has decided to become turbulent as well. There's been sharp temperature fluctuations expected in Latvia. There's some quite warm weather, and I think this will be very negative for Latvia as quite a large part of their exports are comprised.
I've heard it's around 5%.
Yeah, 5%
Yeah.
is we. I think we mentioned that in our past episode. So I think this could spell disaster for the increasingly shrinking European economies, particularly as Europe is forced to become more self-reliant and we will be struggling to import American wheat.
I mean, that's always a possibility with climate change and other such stuff. But I think the Latvian economy will be resistant and they'll be able to push through. The Latvian scientists will create new crops that can withstand anything.
I don't think so. I believe the European
I
Union
think
has
they will
very
be able
strict
to.
regulations about genetically modified organisms.
Could we
But
get into-
they're not going to genetically modify organisms.
Mainly because it's not allowed under European law because their health effects are.
And also, it's really expensive, and as we all probably know, Latvia's budget is not that big.
Yeah. Do you think increased defense spending in Europe will help more money be accumulated in Latvia's smaller but more advanced defense industry, or do you think there will be a centralization of European defense industries controlled by the larger nations that will negatively impact Latvia as it has to still purchase equipment?
I would say that it would be better if every nation is for themselves in a way that. Well, not for
Latvian
themselves.
nationalist.
Not exactly.
It's
for
basically Charles de
themselves.
Gaulle.
Yeah,
Well, not exactly for themselves, but
Charles
like,
Pumpers.
but they support themselves. Obviously, NATO exists and all that.
Do you think Latvia will be able to sustain a functioning defense industry by itself?
Only by itself.
Only by itself.
No.
So do you think
Simple as that.
Latvia needs to collaborate with other nations, combining technical expertise from countries famed for their good engineers, such as Germany or
France.
France or Spain actually has quite
Spain?
Absolutely,
good engineering
yes.
prowess.
Italy has Leonardo's system still, no?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
also-
those-
Which is the only alternative to the Patriot.
yeah. So those somewhat large European
Yeah, yeah.
defense conglomerates are primarily based in
Western
the main
Europe,
five.
yeah.
The main five European nations. Do you think this will be negative for those Eastern European nations, which are already economically lagging behind Western Europe, and now will also be purchasing equipment and be funneling money to the further accumulation of capital into Western Europe as they increase their defense spending?
Well, I mean, it's always good to have some sort of autonomy. France advocated heavily for it with their sort of, what do they call it? I think they call it just strategic autonomy.
Yeah, they still have their independent
They
military
have their
structure.
own nukes, their military structure is separate from NATO. And it's like, in this turbulent time, we've clearly seen the benefits of this with France being able to provide a nuclear umbrella for the rest of Europe,
Yeah.
even though the US has become a bit unreliable.
Yeah. Do you think we should swap out NATO's central command structure for a federal European command structure?
I mean, there's obviously benefits and drawbacks. There's the sort of unified Europe could have quite a large impact on the global stage where we're seeing Europe sort of fade away. But there's also the sort of the problems with racism and integration of the countries,
Yeah.
because I don't know, there's some bad stereotypes out there that we don't want to support.
It could also be very difficult with countries such as Hungary blocking legislation,
That's a good
and
point.
in countries such as Latvia, an ever-increasing Russian political presence could also.
Honestly, I wouldn't say it's ever increasing. I would say, if anything, it's decreasing right
it's
now.
decreasing, really.
It's still a big part of politics in Latvia. However, I do believe it's decreasing.
Do you think that Latvia should try to incorporate those Russians into Latvian society as a whole and sort of create its own cultural identity that is very distinct and is practically as detached from Russia as Latvia is geopolitically?
their histories are quite intertwined. It's going to be quite difficult to separate them.
But you can create their own ethnic and historic identities. This has been done in Latin America, particularly.
But you sound like you're suggesting it in a very synthetic sort of way, rather than naturally developing this culture, which could make it,
really
challenging.
naturally developing takes quite a long time.
Yeah.
But I think particularly the promotion of the Latvian language in schools, the decreasing of Russian as a language used
Yeah,
in
I
certain
believe
communities.
they've abolished that already.
They've abolished all Russian education.
Well, not Russian education. Russian schools are still a thing in Latvia, especially in Riga.
Yep.
But at least a couple years ago, probably in 2022, after the Russia's invasion on Ukraine, there was a new rule set out that schools starting from 5th or 6th grade, or even 4th grade, if I remember correctly, they won't be teaching Russian anymore. Of course, if you already have started Russian, then you will probably learn it until you graduate or you decided to switch languages. And
Do you think Latvia's Russian population or Russian affiliated population would be more likely to side with Russia or with Latvia in the outbreak of war? Do you think Latvia has a fifth column inside it?
I mean, I would say it really depends on, first of all, how long they've lived in Latvia, and also like whether they speak the language, because many places, for example, in embassies, the workers are encouraged to speak only Latvian. So in Latvian, English, or the local language if they do speak that, so that the Russian people who need help, they actually like how to, in a way, it might sound not really, but in a way it might sound a little bit funny and ironic, but like they have to put in the work so that they would not be spoon-fed in a way.
So not really catering to the interests of Latvia's the Russian population, which makes sense. You don't really want to be collaborating with your enemy and promoting their interests inside your country, particularly as they continually threaten you.
All right, let's circle back to this federalization of Europe. So each country would have to vote on whether or not they would be put into the federation, right? Whether they would join the federation. But that creates some interesting challenges, because what if, like Switzerland now, you don't really want to be affiliated with this European federation? So how do you think the European Federation could overcome that?
I think I think Europe should deal with Switzerland as it always has. A mixture of collaboration, but also just leaving them alone. The Swiss are their own thing. If they don't want to participate in the greater European experiment, they don't have to. But Switzerland should have economic restrictions placed on it so that it does not continue being a safe haven for European businesses that want to evade taxation in Europe, or businessmen or criminals who want to evade European subpoenas. So I think Switzerland should collaborate with Europe economically and judicially. And Europe should really have a more unified judicial system. For example, Belgium recently has had some problems because they accept political prisoners, people they consider to be political prisoners from other countries such as Spain. And really what we need is a much more cohesive European system which tries to overcome these particular national opinions while still somewhat considering them in the greater scale of European decision making, which is difficult.
There's already the European Court of Human Rights, but it's not just human rights.
It's not practical.
It's just a last resort.
It can't be used as an appeals court for the Supreme Courts of individual nations, unless it is, of course, a human right issues. But these problems where criminals can simply escape have been plaguing Europe since the 80s. Terrorists from ETA, the terrorist group activating in Spain, can simply cross the border over into France and be safe. I think the integration of European justice and the codification of a set of European laws, given that most European countries already have relatively similar codes based off the Napoleonic Code. I think it would be very productive towards a greater federalization of Europe. However, Europe must ensure that it does not become a bureaucratic sort of cesspit where criminal cases can take decades to be resolved because national courts already struggle. So Europe really has to promote a very large and very efficient judicial system if it wants to do this.
Yeah, it's an interesting take.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think, Gustavs?
Honestly, I'm a little bit puzzled by all this thing.
Do you believe that Latvia shouldn't be integrated into a European judicial structure?
I would say it's like a double-edged sword in many ways.
It really is, yeah.
If you join, then you have the help from others, but if you want to stay individual, other nations might look down at you for not joining them.
Yeah.
And you just like, I would say either way, if that were to happen, whatever your decision is, it's like, it's going to be it will have many drawbacks, and you really have to analyze and synthesize it to realize what would be better for you.
Yeah.
Especially in the long run.
In the long run, it's practically a trade-off where European countries are able to more effectively administer their laws, but individual countries lose say in the greater political and judicial system, which I think would also be helpful. The politicization of justice has been quite harmful in many European countries.
Also, when thinking about this, like if a nation were to join this joint system, would their constitution change in any ways, or?
Definitely, I'd say there would have to be referendums because such large changes in criminal codes and penal codes often require referendums through changes in the constitution, which I think most countries require.
Yeah,
probably.
Also, it probably would be really expensive as you have to change the constitution. You need to.
But this
Many people
economies of scale thing, you don't have to have a different judicial system for each country then, so you might save money in the long run.
Yep. And really, in the end, all you really have to do is make sure that judges administer laws somewhat equally, and then have a large European central court, maybe serving as like a final court of appeals.
Yeah.
Especially focusing on laws of European nations, because I think this centralization of justice in the heart of Europe would help national governments to be less able to enact their powers over the judicial systems in their own countries, which has become an increasing problem in Western society. The separation of powers is decreasing. So circling back, I want to talk about Latvia's economy again. What do you two think about Latvia's current account surplus narrowing recently? Since neither of you take economics, I'll explain this briefly to you. It is basically the amount of money coming in and out of Latvia. So right now there's more money coming into Latvia than there is coming out, but that amount has dropped. If they go from surplus to a deficit in current account, the government has to start releasing its foreign reserves of currency. Do you think this is going to be a continuing theme in Latvia as they try to spend more on the military, particularly since they've tried to increase spending up to 4% or 5% of their GDP, and they're going to have to pay money to these European defense conglomerates?
I mean, we'll probably see a sort of, I don't want to say isolationist sort of policies, but at least a development of the Latvian defense industry and other such industries, heavy industry, because it is, quite important that they have that autonomy, even though we're promoting this idea of a European federalization.
Yeah.
Before that happens, you want to be as autonomous as possible.
Yeah. And you really want these Eastern European countries which are at threat to be able to defend themselves at that first stage more effectively without having to basically bankrupt themselves on this. Because I'm sure Latvia does have the technical expertise to make for a highly specialized defense industry. I'm just not sure if they have the capacity to do this at a large enough scale to equip a decently sized army, particularly because conscript armies are very hard to maintain, as Latvia has.
And people also are not as skilled as professionals would be.
Exactly. This sort of citizen army system isn't as efficient nowadays. But in an all-out war, although this isn't likely to happen, it would be quite necessary to have these citizen armies because the large amount of territory that needs to be covered would require millions and millions of soldiers across all of Europe.
Across all of Europe, that would be exactly
Eastern
what
Europe.
Oh, Eastern
Yeah, I
Europe.
mean, we're assuming this is in case of war with Russia.
Yeah.
There's not really going to be a war with Italy or with Turkey.
Yeah, probably not.
No. This is the most likely outcome, although I believe to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, it is very unlikely to happen, particularly as
I
France
mean, we've
is...
seen sort of, I suppose it's different if both sides have nuclear weapons, but we've seen Russia attack Ukraine and have little consequence.
But Ukraine isn't the same as the rest
Yeah.
of Europe. Ukraine isn't protected by these very harsh treaties, including Article 5 of NATO, and there's something included in the Rome Accords, I believe.
Rome Statute or Accords?
I can't remember.
Rome Statute, I think it was.
That the European Union also has a similar clause to Article 5. So really, any war involving any European nation would call France in. And that France has enough nuclear weapons to bypass all 44 Russian nuclear interceptors. I think they have France has about 200 active nuclear warheads. And since those 44 nuclear interceptors only have about a 50% chance of hitting a nuclear missile, that would still leave about 180 French nuclear warheads that are able to be launched in Russian cities.
But are these ICBMs or are they short-range missile systems like the AMX Pluton?
I believe they are shorter range missile systems, but ICBMs in general, I believe they are all ICBMs because medium range missiles have been almost completely banned by international treaties. I'm not sure if France has ascribed to those, but in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a significant decrease in the number of missiles put in Europe because there were multiple treaties signed banning the use of medium range or intermediate range ballistic missiles.
Interesting. Gustav, as the person who's lived in the European longest here, what do you think about promoting a sort of European identity rather than a Latvian identity?
That's an interesting question, honestly. I mean, the European identity, I would say most overall is about speaking English as internationalism.
Yep.
And a big part of today's youth, mainly teenagers and also young adults in their 20s, a large part of their vocabulary, even in Latvia, is half English. Honestly, for me, it also was that way. Partly because for me, sometimes it's easier to express certain ideas in English, and sometimes I simply do not remember the words for something in Latvian. And I would say that's rather good. However, it's a double-edged sword again. It's rather bad because these people, I'm not going to say lose their identity to Latvia, but they might lose some of the cultural, their cultural link to Latvia. And I would say that's not good because Latvia is the only country that speaks Latvian. Around 1.8 million people in total live there, out of which, as we probably mentioned before, 1.2 are actually like ethnic Latvians, if I remember correctly. And the only similar country that speaks language similar is Lithuania. And there the culture, while it's intertwined, it's somewhat similar. It's not the same thing as every country's culture is rather different, and it really depends what you're trying to do with your life and what are your goals.
Yeah, but also I'd like to add a comment to that. As somebody that has descended from Lithuanian migrants, I can tell you how easy it is to lose that culture in even one generation. My great-grandfather came from Latvia he immigrated to Brazil. My grandfather did not speak Latvian. He did not have Lithuanian. He did not have any connection to Lithuanian identity. So really, these smaller countries have to be more careful with the loss of their identity.
Yeah, and also promoting exports, no, but
cultural diversity.
Cultural diversity. Yeah.
All right. I think this is the end of our podcast. Thank you two for joining me. And see you
on the next one.
Yep.